check the encoder and press the right thing. Streaming, recording, okay. 40 seconds. Alright, I should be being heard then, but just gotta reload this page. Let's see here. Yeah, so you are live. Alright. Okay, but I don't see anybody connected yet. So I wonder. Okay, let me just put on some sound. Okay, good. So people are reconnecting back. So yeah, the stream should be showing on the front of the YouTube page. We're just gonna wait it out until everybody gets back from break. And yeah, so my audio is being heard, so I'm just gonna improvise this a little bit. So if you guys need to, you can go to John Warrington's site and see the past videos there, or on Douglas's front YouTube channel. You can also access most of the videos. I haven't filled in the 2015 that he's published. I gotta should make a note of that. I gotta do that. But for the most part, the past 2015, the episodes are also arranged. So it's John Warrington, Daniel Arola does the drive-by clips, often taking some of the interesting tidbits. I just got an error on my browser. I changed some of the settings on the encoder just a little bit.
We okay there, pal?
Yeah, everything's good.
I don't hear any.
I wasn't. I didn't get into anything.
You weren't saying anything?
No, I wasn't. I'm just doing a little background, but I was checking the stream, making sure
okay.
Everything was kind of going along. So yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. So, am I on? Can people hear me?
It seems like we're live.
Okay.
Let's see. But I don't know. I only see. I can't tell if everybody's connected. I see people are connected and back onto the stream, but.
We must be. Lena Shea said that the music is really spooky, and she hears you.
Yeah. Okay. that must have been extra spooky.
Yeah. So.
Yes. Preparing for Brexit Halloween.
So there we are.
I even have a photo of the Joker.
Yeah, Brexit. Oh, cool. Yeah, that.
I even have a photo of the
cool.
Joker.
Okay, there you go.
I'll show the Joker, man.
Just next time, just use.
Just for fun.
That's right for Miguel. Next time, just show Justin White. It's like he looks like Joaquin Phoenix's twin brother and shit. But we like him anyway, right? And okay, and love Ramona Halitha Henry. She's of course works for a living. Had to take her leave of us, and I'll return to narrative then. Okay, Pavel. I'll get back onto. I appreciate everybody, of course, letting me know if they can hear me, and we're getting whatever happened to the acoustic lady. Says Lena. She hears me loud and clear. And thank you, honey. Glad to know that. And so who be this acoustic lady that she might be speaking of, Pavel? Or is that something you'll tell me about later, perhaps? At any rate, whatever she be, I'll get back into narrative now. And I thank everyone for their patience. And thank everyone for sticking with us through break. Into the next 2 hours at least of our transmission. Thanks be to Ramona Halitha Henry for providing the text and options for the death concerning the suicide prevention hotline, the lifeline they call it these days, appropriately enough. And want to thank everyone who reports in on quality of our sound. And Lena says that acoustic lady refers to the break music, of course. And I'll have Pavel tell me about the backstory behind that at some point in the near future. In the meantime, you're stuck with me. And I know you're fine with that. That's fine. And Ramona Halitha Henry mentions me in a comment. Blessed good night, Team Dietrich, of which you be an integral part, lovely Ramona. Mwah. Blessed be. Our thanks unto you. And Sarah Shields reinforces that comment. Now, okay, as I was saying before break, aside from dogmatic Judeo-Christian shibboleths, measles was considered eliminated in these United States in the opening year of the 21st century and our third Christian millennium because of vaccines against measles, mumps, and rubella. And yet, today, cases have increased in these United States, and public health professionals have called the disease of measles a leading cause of death among children. The Russians are killing your babies, people. This isn't abortion. This is after delivery. And these are the kids you wanted to raise. And in recent weeks, public health officials and state legislators have scrambled to combat new cases of measles all across these United States. By the 4th of this month, by April 4th, the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had already reported 465 cases of measles, more than the total for all of 2018. If you're not angry yet at the goddamn Russians, you should be now. More than all the total of cases yesteryear have been beaten by just the reported cases of measles into this opening season of spring by this point this year. And the threat of measles continues to crop up across the country. In Sacramento, the capital of California, the UC Davis Medical Center sent letters to 200 people who visited its emergency room on March 17th, saying they may have been exposed to the highly contagious disease of measles. In the first 3 months of this year, 387 individual cases of measles have been confirmed in 15 states. That's the second highest number of cases reported in these United States since measles were declared eliminated in the year 2000. The United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention also say 6 outbreaks, defined as 3 or more cases each, are ongoing in 4 states, 2 each in California and New York, 1 in New Jersey, and 1 in Washington. Measles is concerning in its own right. Aside from the discomfort it causes, in 25% of cases, people who get measles are hospitalized. But an overlooked detail adds another layer to the threat. In these United States in particular, measles has a diabolical booster: Russian trolls and bots. Anyhow, I want to thank Ramona Halitha Henry for donating a few dollars to John Warrington. I suggest everyone do the same. God bless her, God bless he, and God bless all of you who help maintain us, my archivist, Jonathan Warrington. He's in England now, and they're headed towards Brexit. He's going to need all the help he can get. Without him, I wouldn't be here. Now, the existence of a Russian disinformation campaign that makes Americans hesitant to vaccinate their children highlights something important about the Kremlin's information war on these United States. Moscow's goal has never been to advantage necessarily the elite of these United States, even though it uses the elitist party of the Republicans as collaborationists in their occupation. But instead, motherfucking Russia is after a far bigger prize: the exacerbation of Americans' distrust of one another, and, in turn, the erosion of their confidence in a society and the United States government, which renders such society infrastructurally supported. A recent study from David Broniatowski, a professor at George Washington University, and his co-authors, confirmed that thousands of Russian accounts used to spread disinformation, desinformatia in their language, had seized on anti-vaccine messaging. After combing through nearly 2 million tweets recorded between 2014 and 2017, those researchers found that Russian troll accounts were significantly more likely to tweet about vaccination than any general Twitter users. They had turned to vaccines as a wedge issue in an effort to ramp up social discord, erode trust in public health institutions, and exacerbate fear and division in these United States. 3 tweets, or rather 2 in particular from the study, go a long way towards capturing the style of this disorienting campaign. In one round of keystrokes, a Russian-backed account lashed out, "Hashtag vaccines are a parent's choice. Choice of a color of a little coffin. Hashtag vaccinate US." Another went with, "Did you know there was a secret government database of hashtag vaccine damaged children? Hashtag vaccinate US." The study concluded that by giving the illusion of a grassroots debate, complete with content pushing against vaccination, Russia could better tap into the fears and divisions among Americans and exploit them. This isn't the first time Russian information warfare campaigns have focused on United States public health. One of the most successful Soviet disinformation efforts, codenamed Operation Infection, spelled in the Russian manner, in the Slavonic, as INFEKTION, infection. Well, we've got just a lovely comment from Ramona Halifa Henry before I go into Operation Infection, in which she says, "Good night, be well, damn the torpedoes." I added by edit 3 hearts to my comment. That's cute. Very well. Blessed night unto she. See her in my dreams. And in terms of Operation Infection, what you had was a very real conspiracy at that time on the part of the United States government under the George H.W. Bush administration of the senior, George Herbert Walker Bush, the senior, to eliminate the homosexual population in the United States. For this reason, AIDS was weaponized from what it originally was, which was a rudimentary chain of molecules, what was called an archaeovirus, RNA, ribonucleic acid, a much simpler single-strand molecular chain of life that expanded our very definition of life itself, that it was concluded by the United States government had evolved on the deserts of Mars. So this truly alien archaeovirus was taken and weaponized and deployed in San Francisco and New York City as the ground zero for what was the elimination of the largest concentrations of gay population in the United States, if not the world. But what happened was that the Russians wanted to go for a population that they figured would be much more influential by its demographic numbers, the African American population, and push them into panic. So, Operation Infection, sourcing out of Moscow, set out to push a narrative based on fact that the human immunodeficiency syndrome virus, HIV, had been created by the United States government at Fort Dietrich, Maryland. But what they fabricated from fact was its purpose, which they promote it as explicitly being the targeting of black people in the United States as opposed to abroad. Now, the Americans did deploy AIDS throughout Africa as a population control weapon of mass murder. In this, they failed miserably. AIDS is still rampant throughout the continent of Africa, but the population just keeps growing. Operation Infection's first volley out of Russia against these United States was a piece published in an English-language newspaper in India, circa July 1983. The arguments were then spread throughout the world through a series of KGB initiatives. By 1987, CBS News had covered the claim. Not only did this effort tarnish America's reputation abroad and weaken the ability of the United States to work with foreign governments to address the HIV crisis, but it also attempted to stoke Americans' distrust in their own government. Because it must be remembered, at that time, I was working with the U.S. government. And being in on the circuit as personal liaison to Michael Aquino, I know for a fact that the weaponization of AIDS was also carried out simultaneously in motherfucking Russia. And we know for a fact that they deployed it in Africa because their own agents of influence, the Cubans, contracted the disease and carried it back to the Western Hemisphere after sexually engaging it as mass raping African women throughout their occupation of Angola. So, with the vectors of the Cubans bringing it back to the Western Hemisphere, the Russians were able to carry a war to the black population of the Western Hemisphere because many of the servicemen in Cuba who were fighting on the side of Fidel Castro were black. Then it spread throughout the Caribbean, came into the Western Hemisphere in the black community, usually killing anybody who was straight only if they were abusive of drugs and sharing needles. But because of the war on both sides, domestically in America under George Herbert Walker Bush Sr. against our gay population, and of course on the Russian war against the black race in Africa, in the hopes of ultimately infecting their Cuban allies to bring the disease to the straight population of the Western Hemisphere. Then what you had was an international pandemic, a crisis at the global level in which biocidal volleys of weaponized RNA, ribonucleic acid, created the worldwide AIDS epidemic in time of Cold War. Michael Aquino was in the heart of it all. He knew the American salvos fired in the AIDS campaign, compared them to the Soviet salvos, and then observed how the propaganda war was being waged on either side to try and take advantage of what had been unleashed. The American government used it for years to portray the gay community as filthy, degenerate, and the cause of their own demise via lifestyle choices. In terms of the Russians, they tried to convince the black African American community of the United States that their United States government was out to exterminate them. And that gambit worked. By 1992, though the Soviet Union itself had collapsed, 15% of Americans by that time agreed that AIDS was definitely or probably created deliberately in a government laboratory. Though the human immunodeficiency virus was indeed weaponized in government laboratories, both in the former Soviet Union and these United States, the impact was particularly strong politically among one of the Soviets' key targets, Black African Americans. A 2005 study by the Rand Corporation and Oregon State University found that over 25% of Black African Americans who were surveyed considered HIV to be the product of an American government laboratory meant to eradicate all blacks in the Western Hemisphere and worldwide. Russia's efforts to spread disinformation about vaccines have taken some pages out of that old playbook. Russian trolls' contemporary messages were crafted with key terms like freedom and constitutional rights, which were oft absent from other anti-vaccination tweets. One Russian disinformation account captured the style of this approach in just 13 words and 2 hashtags. I quoted it verbatim. Apparently only the elite get clean. Hashtag vaccines. And what do we, normal people, get? Hashtag vaccinate US. So Russia's vaccine-related disinformation efforts have provoked calamitous results when it comes to measles vaccine uptake. As the journalist Daniel Engber recently emphasized, outbreaks remain isolated among pockets where community vaccination rates have fallen below protective levels. Still, overall, vaccination rates for measles, mumps, and rubella have remained stable at around 91.5% for children aged 3 and under since 2005. So even with the panic and fear surrounding the current outbreaks, measles still remains under control in these United States at present. Yet panic over the anti-vaxxer movement and its fatal impact on public health remains. Russian disinformatia activities, which have tried to amplify and intensify the debate between pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine activists, have contributed to the insurgency of a growing anti-vaxxer movement, whilst also sowing distrust among Americans. In turn, although this information operation may not have changed United States vaccination rates catastrophically yet, it has successfully identified 2 critical vulnerabilities: inequality and distrust in the public health system. Meanwhile, in Portland, Oregon, the Russian emigre community exhibits a high level of vaccine skepticism. According to the APHA, the acronym APHA, the acronym is for American Public Health Association. According to APHA, Russian language media and social media trolls operating out of Russia actively promote hysterical claims about contamination and harm from vaccines via the Russian immigrant community in the United States. The APHA study found that Russian trolls recognized that vaccine concerns offered a wedge issue that could be exploited to sow anti-government feelings, concluding, whereas bots that spread malware and unsolicited content disseminated anti-vaccine messages, Russian trolls promoted discord. Accounts masquerading as legitimate users create false equivalency, eroding public consensus on vaccination. The trolls have since found their way into Facebook, Pinterest, Amazon, Instagram, and Reddit discussions throughout these United States. A recent survey in the United Kingdom found that half of all new parents had visited online anti-vaccination websites. there be a very strong link between the rise of populism-personated elitism, political reactionary stances, and anti-vaccination sentiments. France's National Party, the National Rally Party in France, and Italy's Five-Star Movement League coalition government both oppose vaccines based on their Russian sponsorship. The Italian Five-Star Movement League leader, Matteo Salvini, Italy's interior minister, lifted all vaccine requirements last year, arguing that immunization was useless and in many cases dangerous, if not harmful. Walter Ricciardi resigned from his position as the head of Italy's National Institute of Health in protest of Matteo Salvini's policy of mass murdering his own populace. One study has shown that vaccine refusal started climbing following the 2010 financial crisis in Europe and imposition of austerity programs in Italy. Opposition was fueled by Five-Star League messaging, casting doubt on the authenticity of science itself, public health, and global forces such as the World Health Organization. While Italy's populist-personated reactionary elitist movement be most tightly linked to anti-vaccination sentiments, across all Europe, right-wing parties be exploiting popular suspicion of pharmaceutical products and antipathy toward governments to sow discord. Most vaccine refusal worldwide goes hand in hand with public distrust in government. The measles virus has resurged in recent years as conspiracy theories about vaccinations have spread online. Most of the new measles cases were in Eastern European and Central Asian countries frequently targeted by Russian disinformation, including Ukraine, Georgia, Serbia, Romania, Moldova, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. It's no coincidence that the largest European measles outbreaks today are in Ukraine and countries formerly part of the Warsaw Pact, inclusive Romania and the Czech Republic. Last year, Ukraine had more than 54,000 diagnosed cases of measles, with 16 deaths. By February 1st, another 15,000 cases and 7 deaths were reported, making the current epidemic the largest the country has experienced since the 1960s Soviet introduction of measles immunization. According to UNICEF, the Ukrainian outbreak be driven entirely by false safety claims about vaccines, and Russian troll disinformation has played the decisive role. In a country where ongoing military clashes between Moscow-aligned and Ukrainian forces has bankrupted public health services. In Eastern Europe, suspicions extend to doctors themselves. 36% of general practitioners surveyed in the Czech Republic and 25% in Slovakia believe the measles vaccine to be unsafe. In the United States, Republican politicians, inclusive President Donald Trump, have voiced opposition to mandatory vaccination and insisted that government agencies are hiding data that allegedly proves immunization causes such health issues as autism and brain damage. A newly published study of 657,461 children born in Denmark from 1999 through 2010, with follow-up through late 2013, confirmed that the vaccine does not trigger autism in susceptible children and is not associated with clustering of autism cases after vaccination. The Danish study is merely the latest of a long list of research efforts that, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, find all vaccines to be safe and an effective way to prevent serious disease. Earlier this week, CNN reported on a woman whose son died from the flu. Rather than receiving messages to console her in her grief, her Facebook page was overrun by messages of hate, blaming her for the death of her own child, calling her a murderess, and threatening her with death. The source of these attacks? Anti-vaxxers. The child did not die because of exposure to any vaccine. In fact, the child had not been vaccinated against the flu, which is why the anti-vaxxers swooped in. Anti-vax groups have developed attacking grieving parents whose children have died from disease as their primary tactic, taught them by the Russians. News that a child has died from flu or some other disease for which a vaccine does or might exist brings a swarm of anti-vax hate telling the parents they're lying and their children never existed, or that the parent murdered them, or that vaccines killed the child, or some combination of all of those. As the report has confirmed, nothing be considered too cruel if it promotes the anti-vax position. This is just like the Russians who sponsored the people who said everyone who died at Sandy Hook was a crisis actor. And all the parents were just pretending that they had children in the first place who never existed. When it came to the man that I mentioned at the beginning of my transmission, who killed himself, it was because he had finally gotten to the point where so many people telling him that his daughter never existed, and he couldn't remember her voice, had a harder time recalling her face without looking at her photograph, drove Dr. Jeremy Richmond to finally come to the point of questioning reality where he thought he had gone mad and was driven to kill himself, to finally be with his daughter in death and prove to himself once and for all that she had existed in the first, that he had brought her into this world. Those same kind of people who can never stop killing the people of Sandy Hook are the same kind of people who drive parents whose children have died of disease to kill themselves by saying they were responsible for something they did not even do. For this reason, if you're an anti-vaxxer, you're nothing more than dog shit. You ought to be stepped on and smeared, along with all the motherfucking Russians who filled your brain with the shit that now spews from your fingertips via keyboard into the internet to harm the minds of those among us who deserve to live. Facebook is now looking for ways to combat disinformation about vaccines being spread on its platform. The stakes are rising as anti-vaccination messaging reaches poorer parts of the world. A wealthy kid in Beverly Hills or Knightsbridge, London, may muddle through and survive life unvaccinated. But their youngster's counterpart in Timbuktu, Mali, or Huehuetenango, Guatemala, faces a serious death risk if left unprotected against the measles. Whilst people in rich countries fret about so-called unsafe vaccines, vaccinators in many poor countries risk their lives to dodge Taliban assassins, Himalayan avalanches, guerrilla fighters in Central Africa, or Amazon floods to bring vaccines to the world's remote poor. And at the end of all such travails, false rumors that pig tissues might have been used in the production of a vaccine be enough to bring parental acceptance to a halt in all Muslim countries. In Texas, Republicans in the state legislature are trying to further ease the already lax vaccination rules for school children, taking cues from State Representative Bill Zedler, who says there's nothing to worry about if measles spreads, because with antibiotics and that kind of stuff, they're not dying in America. Antibiotics, of course, you ignorant white trash piece of shit Tex-Mex son of a bitch. only treat bacterial infections, and measles is a virus. But as State Representative Tex Zedler put it, they want to say people be dying of measles. Yeah, in third world countries they be dying of measles, but not in the Lone Star State. Since 2001, the rate of vaccine refusal in the United States has climbed fourfold. But the anti-vaccination movement be, at its heart, based entirely on the global anti-vaccination movement that predominantly confronts public health advocates today be dominated by highly educated, typically well-heeled individuals such as the wealthiest residents of posh West Los Angeles communities like Santa Monica, Brentwood, and Beverly Hills, where rates of child vaccination be as low as those seen in civil war-torn South Sudan. Or consider the residents of Clark County, Washington, where only 78% of children ever get fully immunized. Declining to vaccinate their children, parents cite everything from excessive drug company profits and hidden mercury contamination to fear of their youngsters developing autism and general opposition to being told by the government to have their children poked with needles. Thousands of parents have taken advantage of a state law allowing philosophical or personal objection to the immunization of the child. Clark County has had 70 confirmed measles cases this year, prompting the governor of Washington to declare a public health emergency, and the state legislature to now consider a bill that would eliminate philosophical objections as grounds for refusing vaccination. Among the affluent and poorly vaccinated Silicon Valley crowd that I myself am so personally familiar with, an absolutely false myth keeps employees of Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and the like from immunizing their children, that the measles vaccine causes autism. Some dog owners even refuse to have their pets vaccinated, fearing they'll have an autistic pooch on their hands. There be no good reason that immunization should be a partisan issue, but in the United States it increasingly is. Exempli gratia, in Arizona, Republican State Representative Kelly Townsend has tapped into widespread sentiments that the imposition of compulsory vaccination undermines liberty. Coupling this with her party's new concerns about socialism in the Democratic Party, Townsend says the promotion of vaccine to attain herd immunity means forcing someone to give up their liberty for the sake of the collective. And that is not based on American values, but rather communist. Darla Shine, the wife of White House Communications Director Bill Shine, has repeatedly in recent weeks tweeted her belief that vaccines are dangerous and the diseases they aim to prevent are actually healthy. She wrote, claiming a case of measles could give a person lifelong protection against cancer. She wrote, "Come breathe on me, measles pox." The alleged cancer curative role of measles be promoted all over the internet, falsely drawing from a Mayo Clinic study that used genetically altered measles viruses to carry treatment into cancer cells. Another source of American vulnerabilities that Russian disinformation campaigns be looking to take advantage of centers on our empire's foreign policy. Take Syria by way of example. Researchers recently released a data set of 3 million tweets from Russian trolls, gathered and published by Clemson University in partnership with 538. The word Syria appeared in nearly 19,000 of them. A preliminary analysis revealed that Russian troll accounts frequently targeted audiences on both sides of the political spectrum to criticize United States engagement in Syria. It wasn't uncommon for the same account to alternate between addressing audiences on the right and on the left. Although the specific messaging used to engage different audiences varied, the overall Russian narrative appears to be built around U.S. incompetence and American malfeasance. Its messaging aligned clearly with Russia's foreign policy objective of limiting United States involvement in Syria and ultimately removing it entirely. Which brings us to why Bashar al-Assad and Russia targeted the White Helmets. Around 6:30 a.m., on Tuesday, dated April 4th, in the year before yesteryear, 2017, before most children had left for school. Syrian Air Force Russian-manufactured Su-22 fighter jets launched missiles at the northern opposition-held town of Khan Sheikhoun. Witnesses recalled a strange odor spreading after the missiles struck. People were choking and foaming at the mouth, and one resident later described how they were suffocating while their lungs collapsed. I know the feeling. I suffered it myself. My lungs collapsed 7 times due to exposure to toxic war gas, a nerve agent, when the Americans blew the bunker in which Saddam Hussein held chemical weapons of mass destruction. And we frontline Marines inhaled it because our mop gear, our chemical warfare suits, charcoal lined as they were, would have killed us wearing them. In the desert heat, with our hoods fully zipped, we were losing 15, 20 pounds of water weight via sweat in as many minutes. We figured it was better to die breathing oxygen than suffocate in rubber. Even if that oxygen was carrying chemical weaponry. Everybody on those front lines is now dead, except myself, due to 2 factors: the nanoplasma transferred bodily into my mortal coil when I was but 14 years of age, and the fact that I underwent radical surgery at the University of California, San Francisco, that stapled my lungs to my ribcage so they would stop collapsing, as they had done 7 times till that point. If it hadn't been for that, I would have been on a chest tube the rest of my life, which wouldn't have been long because I would have killed myself. So those people died there and then in Syria, feeling the way I did and the way so many of those front-line Marines did, as their lungs collapsed and they choked to death on their own organic fluids. According to James Lemasurier, who founded the Syria Civil Defense, commonly known as the White Helmets, the airstrike I'm describing contained a mixture of nerve agent-filled bombs and conventional munitions. The White Helmets were Syrian first responders, and they were oft the only rescue workers on the scene after airstrikes. Soon after the explosions in Khan Sheikhoun, reports of a chemical strike were broadcast over local radio stations. The casualties were taken to a nearby center run by the White Helmets, according to Le Mesurier. In this case, the White Helmets team didn't know what type of agent had been used, so they began the standard protocol of washing down victims. While they did this, a number of the White Helmets were themselves exposed to the toxin. They survived. Victims were shuttled to medical centers in northern Idlib, and arrangements were made for them to receive medical attention in hospitals in Turkey. Doctors in Turkey verified that some victims were suffering from symptoms of nerve gas poisoning, including severe respiratory distress, vomiting, and intense stomach pain. A few hours after the initial attack, conventional bombs hit a clinic where the wounded were being treated. By the end of the day, well over 80 people, many of them women and children, were dead. Hundreds more had been injured. By October of 2017, the Joint Investigative Mechanism, a body created by the United Nations Security Council and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to research chemical weapons attacks in Syria, confirmed beyond a shadow of any doubt that sarin nerve gas, the same cyclosarin nerve gas deployed by Saddam Hussein to eradicate the Kurdish populations in many areas of Iraq, and later on was blown open in Binnaker, in Bunker, by United States Army Corps of Engineers demolitions experts. That impacted my own health, but killed, oh, so many others around me. That same type of cyclosarin nerve gas had been deployed in Khan Sheikhoun, and the Syrian government was determined responsible. The investigators drew heavily on the testimony of the White Helmets and on biomedical, soil, and clothing samples that were provided to them by the White Helmets. These samples were consistent with others gathered after the gassing, including those obtained by hospitals in Turkey. Immediately after the attack, the Syrian regime initiated a disinformation campaign backed by its patron, the Russian government. Both had earlier claimed that a 2013 chemical attack in eastern Ghouta, in which well over 1,400 people were killed, was perpetrated by the opposition, contrary to the conclusions of a United Nations investigation. They had also denied that atrocities such as the targeting of civilians and medical facilities were committed during the siege of Aleppo when regime jets bombed a United States convoy. Aleppo fell to Syrian forces in December of 2016. Now Syria and its Russian ally were head-on denying what they called the myth that Khan Sheikhoun had been gassed by Russian government forces. In Damascus, Syria's foreign minister, Walid al-Mu'allam, said, "The Syrian army did not and will not use these kind of weapons." In Moscow, Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashchenkov essentially blamed opposition fighters for gassing their own people. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs began a propaganda campaign, largely reliant on its agents and followers on Twitter. American cultists, Russian worshippers like Alex Jones and his InfoWars, to distribute falsehoods about the event. These included the claim that the chemical attacks were staged by the White Helmets using actors as part of a Western conspiracy meant to provide both cover for the United States airstrike on April 7th on the Shayrat Air Base and for a plot to bring down Bashar Assad by creating a pretext for military intervention. The Russian and Syrian assessment of the attack was retweeted and hashtagged Syria hoax. According to the Syria Campaign, an international advocacy group that does not take money from governments, Russia's far-fetched claims were shared so widely, they became the #1 trending topic on Twitter throughout the United States and all its territories. A Syria campaign study found that the Russian and Syrian propaganda reached many more people than did any mainstream coverage of the attack, which has also been the case at other points throughout the entire Syrian civil war. It also reported that bots and trolls linked to Russia have reached an estimated 56 million people with tweets attacking Syria's search and rescue organization, the Syria Civil Defense, also known as the White Helmets, during 10 key moments of 2016 and 2017, inclusive of the Khan Sheikhoun chemical attack, the nomination of the White Helmets for the Nobel Peace Prize circa 2016 and 2017, the Aleppo offensive, and the 2016 murder of Joe Cox, a British member of parliament who was a White Helmets supporter, assassinated by the Russians. It be a measure of the total success of this disinformatia effort that I myself was repeatedly asked by educated, well-informed people why Bashar Assad was accused of crimes that the opposition was carrying out. This goes to show you that Russia has more control over your information intake than your own government or your own sense of discernment. Pull your head out of your ass. Stop sucking Russian cock. Stop sucking down Russian shit. And learn to hate the motherfucking Russians who are out to kill you, your children, Mother Nature itself, that they may inherit the world. God damn you all in your ignorance. The de facto leader of the disinformation campaign be a blogger called Vanessa Beeley, former editor of InfoWars, who's been dubbed by The Guardian's former Middle East editor as the Syrian conflict's goddess of propaganda. Alex Jones' functional wife, partner in crime. According to the White Helmet's founder, Les Mesuriers, the group, which first emerged circa 2012, at its height comprised about 3,000 members, has rescued some 115,000 people and lost well over 250 volunteers who gave their lives assisting others. One of the White Helmet's most celebrated missions took place in 2014 when Khalid Omar Horæ, a former home decorator and father of two, pulled a 10-day-old baby out of the wreckage of a building after the infant had been buried for 16 hours. Horæ himself was killed in an airstrike by the Russians circa 2016. A Netflix documentary about their work won the Academy Award in 2017, and Hollywood progressives signed petitions in solidarity. One strategy pro-Assad bloggers used to discredit the White Helmets was to argue that the group was funded by governments that, in the bloggers' view, were intent on regime change in Syria. Part of the White Helmets' funding came from the British government's Conflict, Stability, and Security Fund, which oversees various global projects such as building dams in Central Asia and preventing sexual violence during war, where women's bodies all too often become part of the battlefield. Le Mesurier confirmed that the total United Kingdom government funding of the White Helmets had been about £38.5 million sterling. That would be about 51 million United States dollars over a 5-year period through March of yesteryear. The United States Agency for International Development, USAID, provided about 33 million United States dollars over a similar period. The Qatari Red Cross has made a donation of about 1 million United States dollars to the White Helmets. One of the reasons Qatar was blockaded by the House of Saud and all the trucial sheikhdom of the Arab Emirates on the Persian Gulf. Other funding, of course, came from German, Canadian, Danish, and Japanese governments. These funds supported the group's budget of approximately 30 million United States dollars a year, much of what was spent on equipment such as ambulances, fire trucks, and heavy diggers to recover bodies from collapsed buildings, and stipends for individual White Helmet volunteers, which were a mere $150 a month. But the White Helmet's financial backing was not the real reason why the pro-Assad camp was so bent on defaming them. Since 2015, the year the Russians began fighting with their invasion of Syria, the White Helmets had been filming attacks on opposition-held areas with GoPro cameras affixed to their helmets. Syria and Russia have claimed they were attacking only terrorists, yet White Helmets captured uncounted reams of footage of dead and injured women and children under rubble, specifically where the Russians intentionally attacked churches, orphanages, shelters, any place where they saw children at play or undercover according to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, both, as well as eyewitness accounts. Vladimir Putin's bombers specifically and intentionally and exclusively targeted civilians, schools, hospitals, and medical facilities. A clear violation of international law in their war against all life and all humanity other than the motherfucking white trash sewer shit that comprises their own. Ben Nemo, a fellow at the Atlanta Consul specializing in Russian disinformation, told myself, this above all is what the Russians hated. That the White Helmets were filming and documenting their war crimes against all humanity. Where women and children, the population itself, became their battlefield. Most of Bashar al-Assad's Western apologists have a presence only on Twitter and obscure websites like 21st Century Wire, a website founded by a former editor of American conspiracy theorist Alex Jones's InfoWars. Yet it would be foolish to disregard them. The work of this small group is also spread by a spectrum of far-left anti-West conspiracy theorists, Judeophobes, supporters of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, the Lebanese Army of God, and, of course, by the Ron and Rand Paul cultists, the cocksucking libertarians, and all the far-right groups. At their core, Beeley, the daughter of a British diplomat, a Canadian activist named Eva Bartlett, the Hezbollah-friendly commentator Sharmeen Narwani, and Max Blumenthal, the son of the former Clinton aide Sidney Blumenthal. The Russian government uses Twitter accounts belonging to its embassies, as well as other accounts that have been linked to the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, which oversees trolls and bots to spread disinformation. The views of pro-Assad writers also filter into the mainstream through more respectable Assad-friendly American and British journalists such as Robert Fisk, Stephen Kinzer, and John Pilger, who oversees the Martha Gellhorn Reporting Prize, which was previously awarded to Julian Assange, and for which Veely was runner-up. In turn, their reports be echoed by public figures such as the British Minister of Parliament Emily Thornberry, Baroness Cox, and the Reverend Andrew Ashdown, an Anglican minister. The damage these bloggers have done is incalculable. They have attacked anyone with an account of events that contradicts their own. But their chief target has always been the White Helmets. The bloggers' work be repeated on the state-owned Russian news outlets RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik. Some of it has even been cited by Russian ambassadors at the United Nations. The bloggers resist being linked to the Kremlin, but the Russian version of its own military strikes be forever amplified by bloggers like Beeley and Bartley, who promote RT reports that push the Kremlin's false narratives about the use of chemical weapons in Syria. All while receiving, in terms of their financial transactions, standard fees paid by RT for their television appearances. Talk about paid crisis actors. Beeley, a former consultant to a waste management company in the Middle East with no journalistic background, had only about 42,000 followers on Twitter. But she appeared regularly on RT and Sputnik throughout the Syrian civil war. Her posts were retweeted by the Ron Paul Institute, by all members of the alt-right, and by what Muhammad Idris Ahmed, a lecturer at the University of Stirling and an expert on the Russian disinformation campaign in Syria, called the Red-Brown Alliance. The ultimate unholy coalition of the far left and far right extremists, all claiming to be anti-fascist. Bíli first went to Syria circa 2016 on a 6-day trip to meet with Bashar al-Assad, an encounter she called her proudest moment. Shortly afterwards, she flew to Moscow to meet with the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Mikhail Bogdanov, who'll be Putin's point man in Syria, and Maria Zakharova, Putin's Director of Information and Press. Following that visit, she began attacking the White Helmets vehemently. By 2015, she had called for the first responders to be killed, even though violence to life and person, against civilians and non-combatants in particular, murder of all kinds, be prohibited by Geneva Convention. She tweeted, "White helmets are not getting it. They are the target." Bíli has admitted in a private Facebook conversation with the blogger Scott Gaulke, Scott and his surname spelled Gaulke, in her Facebook messages with him that were obtained by hackers and subsequently published, she herself admitted that Bashar Assad himself reveled in torture. She wrote, "Even government members don't deny it, by the way," adding that she would never admit it publicly. The reason for her dedication to Assad's regime be, like those of other bloggers and writers like herself, somewhat unclear. Apparently she sees Assad not as a war criminal, but as a victim of Western imperialism. All these people be useful idiots propped up by motherfucking Russia. But their undying support of Bashar Assad be based on the anti-Western views that Syria was in line for US-led regime change, like Iraq. The fact that the Iraq invasion occurred under President George W. Bush, while President Obama resolutely refused to intervene in Syria, a stance that drew sharp criticism after the Assad regime first used chemical weapons, never figures into their arguments. But perhaps the most significant evidence of Bíli's influence be that in May of 2017, the deputy Russian ambassador of the United Nations to the United Nations, Peter Ilyushev, submitted a paper titled "Information on the Work of the White Helmets in Syria" to the United Nations Security Council, attempting to link that group to Al-Qaeda. The document was based on a presentation Bíli had given earlier that year in London. In July of 2017, Ilyushev's submission was rejected by 8 countries on the Security Council, which affirmed its view that Syria Civil Defense is an impartial, neutral group. Another pro-Assad blogger, the Canadian writer Eva Bartlett, spoke at the United Nations in December 2016, following a visit to Aleppo organized by the Assad regime after the fall of the city. Bartlett was introduced to witnesses who supported the Russian claims that the Assad alliance had been fighting Islamists, not bombing civilians. A video she made during her trip supported this narrative and was viewed at least 4 million times, which, for a writer not affiliated with any official news organization, be staggering. The Russians pump money into YouTube to promote. They could say that eating shit will save you from cancer. Eat your own shit every day. And they would get 40 million views by putting enough money behind it, and all you motherfucking Americans would spend the rest of your lives eating your own shit. Now, a version of this Russian propaganda flick was promoted on the Russian state video site In the Now with the caption, "Independent Canadian journo totally crushes MSM reporter on what's actually going on in Syria." Anna Nolan, the Syria campaign's former director, be quoted as saying, "It was the most consumed piece of content around Aleppo, more so than any conventional media. Alternative media is now the dominant media." It's all you people watch. And the Russians dominate it. And if you're one of those motherfucking libertarians out there, suck ass. Because you're just a Russian shill. You're the worst. Supporting crap like this. Another prominent pro-Assad figure is Max Blumenthal. Circa 2012, he resigned from his position as reporter for the English language website for the pro-Hezbollah Al-Akbar newspaper in Beirut, for which he had written frequently about the plight of Palestinian refugees. In an open letter, he opposed the paper's pro-Assad views and its featuring of content by Sharmin Narwani and a writer named Amal Saad Ghorayeb, whose work he called malevolent propaganda. Circa September 2013, Blumenthal went to Zaytari refugee camp in Jordan on assignment for The Nation. He strongly opposed U.S. intervention against Assad, but he wrote on Twitter that 100% of dozens I spoke to in Zaytari today want American intervention in Syria, desperately. They're begging for it. But then, circa December of 2015, as Russia was relentlessly bombing Syria, and doctors and civilians were being killed in Aleppo by barrel bombs, Blumenthal was paid by Vladimir Putin to take a vacation in Moscow on a junket to celebrate Russia Today's 10th anniversary. Now, we don't know what happened during that visit, but he was obviously wined, dined, and whored. And afterward, Blumenthal's views completely flipped, compromised as he was, no doubt by his own version of the golden shower tapes. That's so compromised, you're a puppet president. Blumenthal has attacked not only the White Helmets, but also Bana al-Abed, a 9-year-old girl who lived in rebel-held Aleppo and ran a Twitter account with her mother. Blumenthal wrote an essay called "The Right to Resist Be Universal" and attacked Narwani as an Assad apologist and accused anti-Assad Syrians of belonging to Al-Qaeda, claiming that the White Helmets were affiliated with the Islamist group. When, because of his pointing out this 9-year-old girl, Bana al-Abed, she was attacked and, along with her mother, raped to death. Blumenthal said, "That's one less whore in the world. And thank God for the righteous to purge us of her presence." The Australian reporter John Pilger echoes the views of Bartlett and Bealey in interviews. Pilger, who has a high profile in the United Kingdom because of his television documentaries criticizing U.S. foreign policy, has a new platform on RT, which he uses to deny chemical weapons attacks such as the one at Khan Sheikhoun. He too frequently attacks the White Helmets as Islamic extremists and has cited Bealey's writing as if it were authoritative journalism. Some White Helmets, of course, have tried to train their members by getting them to be able to lift people who are totally unable to comport themselves. A person who's limp is a dead weight. There was a training film in which the White Helmets were practicing with mannequins. And, of course, they were trying to teach their men to transport these mannequins on stretchers, as stretcher bearers. They also wanted them to be able to distinguish actual human beings from mannequins in shopping centers that the Russians kept bombing. Because Many shopping centers have mannequins on display. Mannequins can off-waste an enormous amount of expenditure concerning time and manpower to rescue what people would think is a real person. And they turn out uncovering a mannequin. So a video training film, The Mannequin Challenge, showed the carrying of mannequins and the attempts to disambiguate half-buried mannequins from real people. Now, of course, what happened was that video of this was frequently, virally taken by the Russians, spread all over the internet as proof that the White Helmets were a terrorist group, even though the video contains nothing about terrorism. What it insinuates is that there are no real victims. To the libertarians, everybody in Syria is a mannequin, and the White Helmets are simply carrying mannequins all around Syria. For those following events in Syria closely and witnessing Bashar Assad's crimes, the spread of disinformation about chemical attacks be maddening. Christian Benedict from Amnesty International, who regularly responded on Twitter to posts by BLE, Bartlett, and others, be quoted as saying, "So many self-declared progressives who regularly point to war crimes committed by the United States, Israel, and the Saudi regime deny or justify the torture, collective punishment, and all other atrocities committed by the Russians invading Syria in support of propping up their puppet Assad regime. One measure of the regime's enmity for the White Helmets be that Russian planes frequently launch secondary bombing raids known as double-tap attacks in areas where they have earlier dropped bombs. Because the bombs kill people in ground zero, the first respondents get there, and in typical terrorist fashion, just as bombs are set and coordinated to go off in a timed sequence of events, so that the first bomb set up by the Irish Republican Army back in the old days would get all the first responders in area, and then other bombs would blow up to kill all the first responders. The Russians would kill people to draw in first responders, and then attack a second time to kill all the White Helmets responding while rescuing wounded Syrians. Precisely the kind of attack that BLE called legit. One White Helmets volunteer spoke to myself back in 2015. Told me, when we hear that noise of the Russian planes coming back while we're on a site digging, it's the most terrible sound in the world. Another told me that being prevented from rescuing people suffocating under rubble was worse than cruel. It was diabolical. He told me, as far as he was concerned, the Russians are the spawn of motherfucking Satan. I told him he may as well be right. The Assad regime and the Russians who sponsor them neutralized the White Helmets because they were witnesses to war crimes. But the White Helmets were far from the only source of such testimony. The day of justice, had it ever come, would have presented enormous stores of evidence captured on smartphones by civilians and witnesses. The Syrian archive in Berlin has collected and preserved over 2 million digital units, mostly recordings, but also photos, Facebook posts, and tweets made by witnesses documenting human rights violations. Though they estimate the potential number of evidential materials to be far larger than what has been gathered thus far. In a via on the grounds of the United Nations Palais des Nations in Geneva, a group mandated by the United Nations General Assembly circa 2016 and known as the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the IIIM, was cataloging thousands of hours of documentation and reams of paperwork, some of which one day it was hoped would be cited as evidence on war crimes charges. The Russian mission from the United Nations has, of course, condemned the IIIM, calling it illegal, and refuses to recognize it. Most likely, Syria would never request an inquiry from the International Criminal Court, but the IIIM was supported by powerful European countries and was led by a French prosecutor who had a long record of bringing to justice war criminals from Cambodia and the former Yugoslavia. War criminals can be tried in other national jurisdictions, and the IIIM was already preparing cases against war crime suspects from the Syrian conflict, who were even then currently residing, contemporarily so, in France and Sweden. The United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Andrew Gilmore, had been following the Syrian situation closely since 2012. The Syrian government hadn't allowed a single person from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to enter the country since 2014. And for Syrians like Qasim Aid, who narrowly escaped the 2013 attack in Ghouta, the general denial of Assad's attacks in Khan Sheikhoun was excruciating. Checking his Twitter account in the days that followed, Aid was sickened by how quickly the pro-Assad camp was able to persuade ordinary people in the United States of its false version of reality. To quote his Aid, "I don't know what's more disgusting, committing genocide or denying it and twisting facts. As a survivor of Assad chemical weapons, I feel devastated every time he gasses more civilians. But I feel even more heartbroken when I see the propaganda denying it, even accusing the victims of gassing themselves. And now the Russians have won in Syria. Trump has retreated. Bashar al-Assad reigns supreme. And there will be no justice or war crimes trials. And tens of thousands were mass murdered by the motherfucking Russians in their version of a video game, a live-action shooting gallery of civilian families. All glory be to Putin and the anti-gods. In the hell they're raising on Earth. Russian trolling has since continued to shape public opinion along these lines in the United States, an issue on which America remains highly divided. Russian trolls' success covertly engaging with Americans of every political persuasion on the issue of vaccination reveals a clear United States vulnerability to foreign influence. Despite evidence that the vaccine campaign and the Syria campaign targeted both Republicans and Democrats, Russia's disinformation efforts be overwhelmingly partisan. Russian information warfare operations during the 2016 United States presidential election supported the presidency of Donald Trump brazenly and overtly. As the 2020 election approaches, Russia's approach may shift again. Indeed, some of the Kremlin's early propaganda efforts have promoted the candidacy of Representative Tulsi Gabbard, which likely stems from the belief that she supports the preservation of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. Given Gabbard's divergence from the majority of Democrats on key social and foreign policy issues, Russian support for her candidacy mimics its support of Trump in 2016 as a divisive outsider. She may well be hacked into being our next president. And like Trump, you would never have heard of her until she's running your show. Russia isn't interested in the final outcome of partisan American struggles. It's interested in identifying, targeting, and amplifying any and all vulnerabilities of these United States. Efforts to use vaccination as a wedge issue demonstrates just how well Russian information operations can take any issue, identify how it may engage or divide Americans, and manipulate social media discourse to meet Russian ends. Russia continues to employ a disparate network of people and technological tools in order to make Americans turn on one another, their political leaders, their democratic institutions, and even on foundational public health innovations. To counter Russian information operations online in the long run, the United States should resist partisan approaches to any issue which ultimately plays into Russia's hands, especially for public health. Rather, the American empire must make a credible attempt to address the fundamental divisions in its society that Russia has found worthwhile to exploit. Only by mending its social cleavages can the United States develop long-term resilience against the machinations of Russian hybrid information warfare. Unfortunately, there'd be no simple recipe for cooking up bonds of trust amid a broken social contract. Public health leaders and pediatricians be hard-pressed to counter anti-vaccination messaging that be tied to larger political, religious, and cultural divisions and suspicions. Once the obligations of herd immunity be cast aside, the individual trumps the needs of the community. And once the one be more important than the us or the all, it'd be very difficult indeed to reverse that equation. Only I myself, the son of Adolf Hitler, providest you your Vulcan intervention, and I'm completely suppressed by your media machine. Whereas the Russians pump millions of rubles behind everything you see or read that's readily accessible. No one dares to speak my name, even in slander, other than my dedicated gang stalkers, as assigned by Michael Aquino himself. As a voice in the wilderness, I know these breaches cannot be bonded. There's no healing of these wounds. Only war to the point where we take the majority of the Republicans en masse and deport them to Russia, where they can live in the squalor they so admire. In Russian Far East Asia, where the Chinese have many a ghost city, totally devoid of population, fully built and waiting for populations to give a rebirthing renaissance to the Chinese Rust Belt, there in the greater Manchurian region. That is the ultimate destiny for the overwhelming majority of Republicans and Libertarians that we must strive for, that the rest of us may live in peace. In interim, we must strive to inoculate ourselves against the anti-vaxxers. The no-vaccine crowd has persuaded a lot of people, but public health can prevail. Thwarting this danger will require a campaign as bold and aggressive as the one being waged by the anti-vaccination contingent of Russian insurgency. And to launch such a campaign requires overcoming strong inertia, a waning public health apparatus, countervailing politics, and a collective amnesia over the havoc the diseases in question once wrought. But to succeed, be to rescue from oblivion one of the greatest triumphs of human ingenuity over disease. and to save countless lives before us. Here's how to get started. Get tough. After the 2014 California measles outbreak, my golden state eliminated non-medical exemptions for mandatory vaccinations. After a similar outbreak in Michigan, health officials there began requiring individuals to formally consult with their local health departments before opting out of otherwise mandatory shots. In both cases, these tougher policies drove up vaccination rates and saved countless lives. Other states must follow this lead, and the federal government must consider tightening restrictions around how much leeway states can grant families that want to skip essential vaccines. That won't happen under this administration. We must make it the objective of the next. Be savvy. The Vaccine Confidence Project be a London-based academic endeavor that monitors anti-vaccine websites for rumors and conspiracies and addresses them before the messages go viral. It also conducts regular surveys of attitudes and puts out a vaccine confidence index. Federal health officials would do well to implement a similar program. Make it as public as possible and pair it with an aggressive and targeted social media campaign that makes as much use of celebrities as the anti-vaccine movement has. Be clear, vaccines to some extent are victims of their own success. In the United States especially, they've beaten so many infectious foes into oblivion that hardly any practicing doctors, let alone new patients, remember how terrible those diseases once were. An effective pro-vaccine campaign needs to remind us vaccines prevent 2 million to 3 million deaths globally each and every single year. In developing countries, people line up for hours to get these shots. It's also okay to get out of the gray zone. Scientists especially be uncomfortable with black and white statements because science be all about nuance. But in the case of vaccines, there be some hard truths that deserve us to be trumpeted. Vaccines are not toxic. They do not cause autism. Full stop. Fuck you. Know thy enemy. The arguments used by people driving the anti-vaccination movement have not changed in about 100 fucking years. These arguments be effective because they be intuitively appealing, but they are also easily refutable. Instead of ignoring these arguments, an effective pro-vaccine campaign confronts them directly, over and over for as long as it takes. Yes, there are chemicals in vaccines, but they are not toxic. No, vaccines cannot overwhelm your immune system, which already confronts countless pathogens every single day you're alive. Know thy audience. Not every parent with concerns about vaccination be a rabid conspiracy theorist bent on resisting inoculation forever. In fact, studies suggest that less than 2% of all parents fall into this category. The rest of vaccine-hesitant families sit along a spectrum. Some reject all vaccines but are still open to receiving information. Others are only worried about one specific vaccine. And others still be merely anxious and looking for reliable information. Any successful campaign will need to mind this diversity and prioritize listening to concerns as much as dispelling myths. Finally, enlist the right support. Some doctors and scientists have referred to uneventful vaccination as the greatest story never told. Though they may not spread on the internet like the stories of terrible mishaps that anti-vaxxers traffic in, these far more common tales of inoculation sans incident can be a powerful elixir for a nervous new parent. The best ambassadors of these stories are likely to be parents themselves. Surveys suggest that pro-vaccine families are often eager to help counter misinformation, but they don't know where to start. If health officials corralled these families and trained them in the basics of vaccine science, they might succeed where official voices sometimes fail. Now, all of that brings us to the global governance that bringeth about the death of disease. We can bring about the death of most diseases in our lifetime. We can do that with universal health care throughout the world. Now, I may not have time to get into that entire spectrum of information within the last half hour of tonight's transmission. But we can start suggesting how we get there on that road to an affordable necessity. Both in rich and poor countries, universal health care brings huge benefits. The argument for universal health care be clear, but getting there be difficult. In May of 2014, dozens of mourners attended the funeral of a healer in the Kailahun district of eastern Sierra Leone. She had died after tending to people struck by fever, vomiting, and bloody diarrhea. And as women ritually washed her corpse, 14 of them contracted the virus that had killed her and many others who had sought her remedies. After the Ebola virus had swept through West Africa in the worst epidemic of the 21st century so far, as many as 365 deaths were traced to that single burial. In all, the outbreak killed 11,310 people that I know of. When Baylor Berry, a Sierra Leonean doctor, heard about the first cases of Ebola in his country, he knew it would spread quickly and widely. To quote his tea, Sierra Leone is a health desert, no surveillance, no public health system. Life expectancy was already just half 100 years, and 1/8 of children died before their 5th birthday. Most clinics offered no prospect of affordable, acute, or accurate diagnoses and effective treatment. So few people trusted clinics when they became ill. Before the Ebola outbreak, the country had just one doctor for every 50,000 people. America has one for about every 400. China, the communists, have one for every 275. And then 7% of Sierra Leone's few health workers that they had died from Ebola during the epidemic. That epidemic was an avoidable tragedy. A slow international response, especially by the World Health Organization, the United Nations Geneva-based public health body, and inadequate domestic health systems proved a lethal matrix. Probably more people died as an indirect result of the outbreak than from the virus itself. The number of children treated for malaria in Sierra Leone in September of 2014 was 39% down on 4 months earlier because health workers were so overwhelmed. Writing circa April of 2015, Bill Gates, whose family foundation spends more on health aid than most rich countries do, expressed the hope that Ebola would serve as a wake-up call for public health. Since then, the World Bank has launched a facility that will help meet the cost of responding to a future pandemic. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the Ethiopian who took over as Director General of the World Health Organization in July of 2015, received his daily briefings as disease outbreaks from all over the world. He knows the hot zones. That did not happen under his immediate predecessor, Dr. Margaret Chan, who occupied the post for 10 years. But Ebola has also encouraged a broader rethink of the approach to global health, shifting the emphasis from trying to eradicate single diseases to building health systems that be resilient to diverse threats and less reliant on aid. One of the aims be to reduce the number of people pushed into poverty by having to pay for health care. Central to this effort be the embrace of universal health care, the idea that everyone should be able to get care they need without facing financial ruin. All countries have committed themselves to getting there by 2030 as part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, a voluminous set of targets agreed on circa 2015. That commitment marks a new chapter in global health. Even though recent years have seen remarkable improvements, Child deaths, for example, fell from 10 million in 2000 to 6 million circa 2015. Much still remains to be done, and of course is under siege by the goddamn Russians. A report published in December by the World Bank and the World Health Organization found that at least half the world's population does not have access to what be deemed essential health services, such as antenatal care, basic treatment for malaria, HIV and tuberculosis, and checks for high blood pressure. Another study, circa 2015, for The Lancet, a medical journal, estimated that 5 billion people around the world cannot get basic surgery such as a cesarean section, a laparotomy, that's an incision in the abdominal wall, or even the repair for a fractured bone. According to the paper from the World Bank and the World Health Organization, 800 million people spend more than 10% of their household budget on healthcare, and nearly 100 million are pushed into extreme poverty, defined as having less than $1.90 a day to live on every year by out-of-pocket health expenses. This chimes with smaller-scale studies. A survey last year of patients at a government hospital in Uganda discovered that 53% of their households had to borrow money to pay for treatment, and 21% sold all their possessions. About 17% lost their job. It used to be common even for people in rich countries to have to choose between financial or physical health. When Britain's National Health Service, the world's first universal healthcare system free at the point of use, was established circa 1948, households received leaflets telling them that the service would relieve your money worries in time of illness. Since then, many more countries have followed suit with comprehensive health insurance schemes. As nations get richer, they spend more on health. This is known as the first law of health economics. As a share of gross domestic product, the developed world spends roughly twice as much on health as developing countries do. But this does not mean that once the world gets richer, universal healthcare will necessarily follow. Nor are rising incomes the only cause of improving health. Wealth and health be intertwined, but only up to point. In a book entitled The Great Escape, a work on the historical relationship between health and growth, the author Angus Deaton, a Nobel laureate in economics, explains that a country's GDP per person be linked to its life expectancy. On average, as national gross domestic product per person rises, their people live longer. Higher incomes mean they have more money to buy food and medicines with, and governments be better able to afford public health measures such as sanitation. But life expectancy over time has increased even more than implied by rising incomes. For Mr. Deaton, this be evidence that income is not the only factor. The application of knowledge also matters. He concludes, there are ways of ensuring good health at low incomes and ways of spending large sums of money to no purpose. America being the primary case in point. So you don't have to be rich. Universal health care be both desirable and possible even in low-income countries. Some countries achieved near universal coverage when they were still relatively poor. The Empire of Japan reached 80% when its gross domestic product per person was only about $5,500 a year. More recently, several developing countries have shown that low-income and comprehensive health care are not mutually exclusive. Thailand, where those kids were trapped in the cave, for example, has a universal health insurance program and a life expectancy close to that in the OECD, the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development Club, of mostly wealthy nation states. In both Chile and Costa Rica, income per person be roughly 25% of that in the United States, and health spending per person just 12%, but life expectancy in all three nations be about the same. Rwanda's GDP per person is only $750, but its health care scheme covers over 90% of its population. And infant mortality rate has halved in a decade. Dr. Berry concluded Ebola would not have happened there. This may start off a virtuous cycle. It be becoming increasingly clear that better health can lead to higher incomes, as well as the other way around. Economists at the World Bank used to call spending on health a social overhead, but now they believe is that it speeds up growth. Timothy Evans, one of the senior directors of the World Bank, has confirmed this via a study carried out circa 2011 by the University of St. Gallen that looked at 12 European countries between 1820 and 2010 and found a close link between the expansion of healthcare, a fall in mortality rates, and growth in GDP per person. Another study found that in Britain, as much as 30% of the growth in GDP between 1780 and 1979 may have been due to better health and nutrition. A paper by two leading economists, Dean Jameson and Lawrence Summers, found that 11% of the income gains in developing countries between 1970 and the year 2000 were attributable to lower adult mortality rates. Smaller scale studies support these historical analyses. Improving health, for example, through malaria eradication efforts, be associated with children receiving more schooling and going on to earn more money in adulthood. And lower out-of-pocket health costs reduce inefficiencies in purchasing healthcare and can encourage consumer spending. Clearing land of disease-carrying parasites opens it up to farming, mining, and other forms of development. Pioneering countries and new research have added to the argument in favor of universal health care. So too has the growing realization among the largest institutions in global health that eliminating specific diseases is hard in places where basic health systems be dysfunctional. Indeed, single disease programs can make the problem worse by setting up parallel structures or diverting healthcare workers. Mr. Gates has recently called for more investment in primary healthcare, a core part of achieving full coverage to improve the outcomes of his own foundation schemes. Making a commitment to universal health care be the easy part. The hard part for both governments and international organizations be to find ways to make the best use of limited resources and then get on with reform. That task be made even tougher by shifts in the burden of disease. And of course, the assault from the Russian Empire on all humanity to prevent vaccinations from ridding us of the scourge of the human species. Ultimately, to rid ourselves of diseases, we must rid ourselves of the Russian influence by creating entirely independent internets that all firewall the Russian Antichrist from its assault on our future. Russia must become the internet pariah, totally walled off. We want no information from Russia. We don't want to know what's happening in Russia. We don't want them to tell us anything. We don't care. Russia must become informationally quarantined. Nothing in, nothing out. Let them stew in their own shit until they choke. And only then will universal health care worldwide be within reach. The case for it being all-powerful, most intensively in the poorest of countries. By many measures, the world has never been in better health. Until the Russian assault on vaccinations, since the year 2000, the first year of the third millennium of our Lord, the number of children who die before they be 5 years of age had fallen by almost half to 5.6 million. Life expectancy has overall statistically reached 71 years of age, a gain of half a decade for all humanity in general. More children than ever are vaccinated until the Russian disinformation campaign brought us back to the Middle Ages. Malaria, TB, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS were all in retreat. Yet the gap between this progress and the still greater potential that medicine offers has never been wider. At least half the world be without access to what the World Health Organization deems essential. The aforementioned antenatal care, insecticide-treated bed nets, screening for cervical cancer, and vaccinations against diphtheria, tetanus, and whooping cough. Safe basic surgery be out of reach for 5 billion peoples. Those who can get to see a doctor off pay a crippling price. Over 800 million people spend over 10% of their annual household income on medical expenses. Nearly 180 million spend over 25%. The quality of what they get in return is often woeful. In studies of consultations in rural Indian and Chinese clinics, just 12 to 26% of patients ever received a correct diagnosis. So just having more doctors in the communist Chinese population doesn't mean they're any better. All this be a terrible waste. As special reports have shown, the goal of universal basic health care be sensible, affordable, and practical, even in poor countries. Without it, the potential for modern medicine is being squandered. We'll get back into a bit of this with my next transmission, or another transmission sometime in the near future. For right now, I want to thank all of you for staying with me throughout tonight's transmission. God bless you all who support myself. And of course, your financial support of myself is also appreciated. Now, my thanks to everyone on Team Dietrich. Ramona Halitha Henry is left for the night. I thank is my volcano crown princess in the Pacific, my lady Judith Hager. I thank is, of course, all the fangirls who participate in supporting Team Dietrich, Lena Shea, and of course my Maki benefactress in anonymity. I thank is Sarah Shields and oh so many others, especially the men who I tend to neglect. Of course, my archivist, John Warrington, support as he as you would myself. And of course, I thank is my executive producer, Pavel Edward Pravara, for providing us that introduction tonight. Blessed be they, and blessed be all of you who provide us me support. Damned be our enemies and their adherence to the anti-gods. The cult of Aquino and his kings of Edom runs rampant across the earth. Our war in the cosmic sense, the metaphysical sense, may be eternal. But there's much we can accomplish towards the greater balance in our lifetimes. Ours be the most important generation in history, my generation, the 13th American generation. Like all peoples of the world, the developed world, anyone in any modern developed nation state that's a member of my generation be the most aborted generation in history. We are the choke point in the hourglass between all generations that came before us in the negative numbers and all the generations that we will sire and have sired thus far, the positive numbers that come after us are Generation Zero, on us falls the most monumental responsibility of all human history. That of struggle for the future of humanity in a time of environmental collapse. Blessed be thy night. Join us again at end of week's end on Sunday night for our next transmission. Until then, spread awareness as you would if your life depended on it and the lives of those you love. Spread us my name where no one else will say it, because that's the only hope you have.